Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to break down a source that presents a really countercultural path for young men. It's a faith-based guide on sexual purity. In this explainer, we're going to unpack its core philosophy and all the practical strategies it lays out, piece by piece. So, right off the bat, you see the title. It's definitely designed to grab your attention, right? It's provocative, and it really sets the stage for a message that cuts directly against so much of what we see in mainstream culture. This isn't just about a single behavior. The guide frames this whole thing as a journey toward what it calls sexual victory and, ultimately, authentic freedom. All right, to really get a handle on the guide's approach, we're going to follow its structure. We'll start by understanding what it calls the modern battlefield. From there, we'll look at building an inner core, then get into the practical strategies for victory, cover the importance of community and no man wins alone, and finally, we'll talk about the ultimate goal it presents, the reward, true freedom. Okay, first up, the modern battlefield. The source argues that, look, before you can even think about a strategy, you have to know the terrain. It frames our modern cultural landscape as a kind of battlefield, one that presents a huge challenge to its ideals of purity. So what does this battlefield actually look like? Well, the guide describes it as an unrelenting onslaught. It points to three major forces at play. First, you've got media saturation, where sexual themes and imagery are just woven into almost everything we watch and hear. Then there's peer pressure, which is driven by this idea that sexual experience is what makes you mature or normal. And finally, you have the overall normalization of casual sexuality, which the guide argues really treats sex as something trivial with no real deep consequence. Now, to back this up, the guide points to a specific number. It cites a 2019 CDC study showing that 38.4% of U.S. high school students said they'd had sexual intercourse. And here's where the guide's interpretation gets interesting. It completely flips the script on that peer pressure idea. It basically says, hey, if you feel alone for choosing this path, the numbers show you're not in the minority. You're actually part of the majority experience. So if that's the external world, the next step is to look inward. This section is all about building an inner core. The guide's argument is that to have any kind of lasting success, you need more than just good tactics. You have to build a really strong inner foundation that can anchor you against all those pressures from the outside. The guide kicks things off with a key definition: abstinence. And it's defined pretty simply as just refraining from all forms of sexual contact. This is presented as the starting line. It's a clear behavioral commitment, but, and this is important, it's only the foundation. It's not the whole building. And that's where the guide makes this crucial distinction between abstinence and what it calls sexual purity. See, purity is presented as something much bigger, a more holistic commitment. It's not just about what you don't do with your body, but also about what you actively do cultivate in your mind, your thoughts, your intentions, and it all stems from a deep foundation of personal faith. This quote from the source really gets to the heart of the motivation it's trying to build. It frames purity not as something you achieve with just brute willpower, but as a gift. So the work, then, isn't about earning it, but about preparing yourself, to dispose yourself, to be able to receive it. This totally shifts the mindset away from feeling deprived to instead feeling like you're preparing for something with a real purpose. Building on that idea, the text basically says that the eyes are the gateway to the mind, and the mind, well, that's the main battlefield. The strategy here is really twofold. First, you have to actively guard what you look at, avoiding things like pornography and other suggestive content. And second, you have to proactively replace those consuming habits with what it calls edifying ones. Things like good books, sports, music, or prayer. So, we've talked about the landscape and the internal foundation. Now we get to section 3, strategies for victory. This is where it gets really tangible, all about practical actions. The guide is very clear that just wanting something isn't enough. Purity, in its view, demands deliberate strategies and daily habits. The source outlines this three-pronged physical approach that it calls taking your body to task. The whole idea is based on this age-old concept that self-denial in small things builds up the spiritual muscle for self-control in the big things. The three core disciplines it lays out are fasting, physical mortification, and daily discipline. Let's dig into each of these. First up is fasting. The logic presented in the guide is actually super straightforward. If you can train your will to say no to a basic, natural appetite like food, even in a small way, you're literally strengthening your ability to say no to other, more powerful appetites when they show up. It's all about building that habit of self-control. The second strategy is what the source calls physical mortification. I know, the term itself sounds pretty intense, but the guide uses it to describe a practical technique that draws on historical examples. The idea is that introducing a form of physical discomfort, like taking a cold shower, can act as a sort of circuit breaker. It's meant to redirect intense desires and sharpen your willpower by forcing your mind and body to focus on a totally different immediate sensation. And the third physical strategy is all about daily discipline. This one is less intense, but you could argue it's even more fundamental. According to the text, simple, consistent habits, like actually waking up when your alarm goes off instead of hitting snooze or making your bed every morning, these things create what it calls the architecture of a disciplined soul. These small daily acts of self-mastery build a structure that can support that larger goal. Now, beyond those physical disciplines, the guide presents a really key strategic principle: run from temptation. This is about being proactive, not reactive. It means you have to identify your personal triggers, the people, places, or even the times of day that make you most vulnerable, and then you actively have to restructure your life to avoid those situations completely. It's framed not as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of wisdom. But then right after that, the guide says something that might sound like a total contradiction. It says, don't run from your struggles. So wait, what's the difference? Well, the second piece of advice isn't about running toward temptation. It's about being brutally honest with yourself and with others when you fall short. The logic here is that shame just loves secrecy. It thrives in the dark. The guide argues that by bringing a struggle into the light, by confessing it to a person you trust, you strip it of its power. This act of disclosure is presented as a powerful weapon, making the temptation, as the quote says, half overcome, right there. And that idea of bringing things into the light leads us perfectly into our fourth section: no man wins alone. The guide is absolutely adamant on this point. This is not a solo mission. It says the battle for purity simply cannot be won in isolation. The environment you build around yourself and the relationships you choose to cultivate are essential for success. The source details 3 critical types of relationships you need. First, brotherhood. Actively seeking out friends who actually share your values and will hold you accountable, not friends who will mock your goals. Second, mentors. Finding a trusted older man, could be a pastor, a coach, a family member, who can offer wisdom and guidance from their own experience. And third, open communication. Being transparent about your struggles with parents or spiritual leaders and framing that honesty as a strength, not as a weakness. So, after all the struggle, all the discipline, and all the community building, what's the point? What's the end goal? Our final section, the reward, true freedom, really explores the why behind this entire journey. The guide frames the outcome not as a life of missing out, but as a life of authentic freedom and deep joy. This slide really captures the core sales pitch of the guide, if you will. It sets up this direct contrast between what it calls the cultural promise, which it defines as casual experience and fleeting pleasure, and the guide's promise of authentic masculinity and lasting joy. It's basically presenting a choice between 2 very different definitions of what it means to live a good life. So to sum it all up, the guide claims that the hard work of self-mastery pays off with 3 profound rewards. First, there's peace within. That sense of alignment you get from living according to your deepest values, free from that inner conflict. Second, there's authentic masculinity, which it defines not by conquests but by virtue and real strength of character. And finally, a life of purpose, arguing that when your energy isn't constantly being scattered by lust, it can be focused on mission, on brotherhood, and on achieving something great. And so we end with the central question this guide really leaves us with. It challenges our conventional ideas of freedom by suggesting that maybe, just maybe, true liberty isn't found in indulging every single desire, but in mastering them. So in a world that is full of constant temptation, what does it actually mean to be truly free? That's a question worth thinking about. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.